people say a lot. Oh, but Israel doesn't target civilians while Hamas does. And I'm not agreeing with this, but I wanted to know if you wanted to take that one or not.
I mean, I think the numbers speak for themselves. Israel has been bombarding one of the most densely populated places on earth, where there are more than 2 million people, and you have millions of civilians that have nowhere to go. There is nowhere to go. There are no bomb shelters for them to hide in. There are no warnings. There are no sirens going off to let them know that they're about to be bombed. And, I can look at the numbers here, but currently, the last time I checked was, maybe half an hour ago. It's very well that those numbers could have changed, because the death toll is literally rising by the minute. But at least 198 Palestinians, including 58 children, have all been killed in the past week. That's in 7 days. And that number is continuing to rise. Just, last night, in the middle of the night, Israel bombed a very densely populated civilian neighborhood in the middle of Gaza City, which is very close to Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital in Gaza. So last night was one of the deadliest nights so far. There have been 42 people that were killed and more than 50 injured. Many of them were children. Again, this was a civilian neighborhood. 2 of the people that were killed in last night's airstrike were 2 of Gaza's top doctors, including one of the only neurologists in the Gaza Strip, Dr. Mu'in Al-Alul, and the head of the coronavirus response team at Gaza's biggest hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, Dr. Ayman Al-Ouf. So again, I think the numbers speak for themselves when Israel says we don't target civilians. More than 50 children have been killed. You have doctors being killed. We saw buildings housing media offices being targeted. One of the sort of remarkable things to note about what happened last night was it wasn't just that people's houses were bombed and, the most densely populated civilian residential neighborhood, is that also the streets on the neighborhood were also bombed. And these are the streets that lead to Al-Shifa Hospital. So also the infrastructure that allows Palestinian first responders to respond to the people that were bombed and allowed the injured to be taken to the hospital, that was also targeted as well. So I think that's, all people need to know, when responding to sort of questions like that.
It's so often repeated by the media as if it's a fact, and no one actually looks at it and no one defines it. Like, what does it mean to target a civilian? When Israel kills people who are civilians, that it's not targeting it because a militant was killed? That's still targeting a civilian. The whole thing is a distraction from the fact that Israel is just an occupying power, violating human rights law and international law. Gazans have the right to defend themselves because they're occupied. Like, they're the ones who have that right under international law.
Right. And they also have the right to not be, murdered and bombed in the middle of the night,
Right.
B'Tselem, which is,
Yes.
the leading Israeli human rights organization, they came out with a statement yesterday hinting at this sort of argument that you've been talking about, that, Israel doesn't target civilians, and that the bombing of such civilian structures is justified because Israel has intelligence that it's used, whatever, by Hamas militants. And B'Tselem came out, I'm just pulling it up here, saying that, Israel is committing war crimes in the Gaza Strip by killing blockaded civilians and destroying infrastructure on a massive scale. And something that they noted was that IDF spokesperson has admitted that Israel's action in Gaza are as far from pinpoint accuracy as you can get. They're making Gaza City shake. The spokesperson also said that the military was attacking military targets belonging to terrorist organizations, even at the cost of harming uninvolved individuals from whose crowded, populated neighborhoods Hamas and Islamic Jihad have chosen to launch rockets. And that is, the most common sort of argument that we see on the part of the Israeli military, is that it's Hamas's fault, that we have to target these civilian neighborhoods. But then B'Tselem goes on to say that indeed Palestinian armed groups may have been launching rockets at civilian populations, concentrations inside Israel since Monday, including heavy barrages, etc. Yet the message conveyed in the IDF spokesperson's statement is that no matter how Israel responds or how horrific the results, its actions will be legitimate. This stance is unreasonable, unlawful, and empties the fundamental norms of international humanitarian law, which Israel is obliged to uphold, of meaning. The hundreds of bombs Israel is boasting of raining down on Gaza are not part of a new policy. Israel bombs the Gaza Strip from time to time at varying degrees of intensity, killing people and damaging civilian property and infrastructure. And they basically go on to say that, as you mentioned, the onus is on Israel as the occupying power to uphold international law, and that international law actually does not allow for Israel to bomb civilian structures using, the current arguments that they are. And they're saying that in the current circumstances, the policies that Israel is enacting and the actions that they're undertaking are the same ones that they're currently under investigation for in the ICC for the crimes they committed in 2014. So they're saying, it's happening again, obviously.
I want to thank you again for doing what you're doing, because there are not a lot of people doing that. It's a kind of, I imagine, a tense place to be. And as people probably know, IDF bombed an AP building. How does that make you feel as a journalist?
The whole discourse, obviously, and the conversation surrounding the bombing of the Jalab building, which housed a bunch of international media offices, including AP and Al Jazeera, is interesting because obviously, first of all, this is the third media office that Israel has targeted in the airstrikes in the past week. Previously, they targeted two buildings that house local Palestinian-run organizations, and obviously those didn't get as much attention as the bombing of foreign press offices. Obviously, as a journalist, it's disturbing, but I don't think it's surprising. Palestinians, specifically Palestinian journalists, know very well that Israel does not respect international norms when it comes to the treatment of journalists and the press. Palestinian journalists are routinely injured, killed by Israeli forces in Gaza and both in the West Bank. Palestinian journalists are routinely detained and arrested by Israeli forces and imprisoned, often for long periods of time, sometimes with no actual trial or charge as part of Israel's administrative detention policy. So I think, obviously, as journalists, it's upsetting, but by no means is it shocking, because Israel has a long track record of targeting Palestinian journalists and targeting and not respecting international norms when it comes to press freedoms. I think that people are just suddenly aware of it because, they were targeting media offices. And it's worth saying, and it's something that Palestinians have also been saying, something I've been seeing a lot on social media is, obviously, Israel doesn't respect press freedoms because we've seen, their actions in the past towards Palestinian journalists. And what happened was a grave violation of international law. And it was wrong and shouldn't have happened. But the world has seemed to be more outraged by the bombing of the press office than they have the killing of Palestinian children and people for the days before that. So
no one really cared about collateral murder. The video that Assange helped Chelsea Manning publish, there were Reuters reporters, but they were locals, so no one really cared.
Yeah.
With Saudi Arabia, the thing that got people mad was that people knew Khashoggi, right? He was a journalist who people knew he had kind of international connections and, elite connections. And that's why people were horrified. But it's fine if you're just a local person from those places.
Yeah. And it's something I've actually been thinking about. I mean, now with, there's still heavy COVID restrictions in place in Israel and obviously in Palestine as well. And the people that are really on the ground covering what's happening now, the vast majority are local Palestinian journalists. They are the ones leading the coverage of what's happening right now on the ground. They're the ones that are, exposing Israel's crimes in real time to the world. It's different this time around compared to, just from what I've seen on the ground at the protests that we've been to across the West Bank in 2017, for example, back when Trump recognized, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, et cetera, and all the fallout that happened after that. There were protests happening every day here, and there was foreign press everywhere. I mean, I think I saw one foreign journalist, in the past few days. So Palestinian journalists are really leading the coverage, as they have done for years, obviously, but especially this time around, I've really been only seeing, Palestinian journalists on the ground, and that also is obviously cause for concern because it just makes you wonder if Israel is just going to be more brazen in its use of excessive force against the press because, well, frankly, they don't have to worry about killing foreign journalists, and they're used to killing Palestinian journalists.
It's also a weird thing when people are basically like, please stop killing innocent civilian journalists. Can you limit your killing to innocent civilian non-journalists?
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's something, and I mean, well, I think that's just a result of, the discourse around Palestine is Palestinians are constantly forced to like prove their humanity to the world and prove that they just deserve to live and that they deserve to exist. It's just why, unfortunately, people fall into, and it's not by anyone's fault except for, the international community and the media that perpetuates these narratives. But, when we see these reports, it's like, of course, people are going to focus on the attacks on journalists or the attacks on foreign press offices, because unfortunately, that's what gets people's attention, not the killing of Palestinian civilians. And even, today, 15 people in last night's airstrike on the Gaza, 15 people of the same family were killed. The entire families are being wiped out. And I was just thinking, they saw the list of the names and the ages, and there were a number of children. But, okay, technically 18 and under is children, right? But there was also a 19-year-old and a 22-year-old and a 23-year-old. It's like these, you can't even, at some point, it's like, I don't even want to be the one saying, oh, X amount of people were killed and of them children, because it's like, this is just so heinous all around. It doesn't matter, the ages of the people. That obviously the killing of children is horrendous, but, and the killing of journalists and attacking of foreign press offices is horrendous as well. But overall, these are just heinous crimes that are being, perpetuated against the Palestinian people and against people in Gaza, and none of them, deserve this.
Right. No, that's very true. And I think that part of it is also because, as you said, there's such a dehumanization and such an attempt to just pathologize all Palestinians as the same, and all like suicidal and I mean, there's so much built into that. So while I totally understand what you're saying, the takeaway should not be like, but for them being children, it would be okay. So right. I hear what you're saying, and and it's like this double labor that has to be done, because there's so much PR saying that Palestinians are one thing and want to push Jews into the sea, whatever, implant the not true thing that is said.